Okay, so welcome everybody. We are the Surveillance Capitalism Parallel House Student Fellow team. Today we're going to be presenting the research we've been conducting for the past year on the topic of reconceptualizing user privacy in a new era of data commodification. I am Guy, and together with my team, we're very excited to introduce our work to you guys. So from a perspective of introducing our problem and the idea of surveillance capitalism, which we're focusing on, we want to give you a little bit of a problem scope. So we're concerned with the fact that the rise of modern technology has led essentially to many questions being raised about data control, data privacy, and how much public and private organizations have control over individual as well as organizational data around the world. And that comes as a result of the fact that personal and behavioral data allows for organizations to essentially track and influence several aspects of our lives and of their customers' lives, leading to a plethora of ethical debates and issues that arise. And today we're going to be looking at a few parts of the problem as well as solutions that involve some of the key players, including the general population, which are the individuals around the world that are creating data and owning the data and that are engaged in the digital world. We're also going to be talking about government as the regulators of data rights and the ones that overlook surveillance capitalism. And then we're going to be talking about private enterprise and companies who are the innovators and what we will call the digital system architects that create this technological infrastructure. We also want to highlight a little bit of the work by Professor Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a very popular book around the idea of surveillance capitalism titled The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, The Fight for a Human Future at the New Frontier of Power. And we want to bring forward this quote that we believe really sets the ground to contextualize the idea of surveillance capitalism. And it says that in the future that the surveillance capitalism prepares for us, my will and yours threaten the flow of surveillance revenues. Its aim is not to destroy us, but simply to author us and to profit from that authorship. And that highlights the complicated relationship that these ethical issues around data privacy and data rights are brewing in our society nowadays.
So I'm going to talk about some of the implications of the data monopoly. So in 2019, Canada released a digital charter distinguishing data as a fundamental economic driver. As a result of this, we've seen a rise of data monopolies. Scholars have noted this as the innovation finance nexus, which is an extraction of value through the control of assets rather than a focus on the assets themselves. This assetization of data has impeded vertical innovation because it creates exclusivity over data usage. And we can see this by a drive to acquire companies just for their data assets. For example, Google acquired Nest for over $3 billion, which is worth more than the entire smart thermometer market at that time, simply because of all the data that they collected. So we can also see platform-based companies creating negative externalities, in particular, a violation of sovereignty. We see this with Facebook's mood manipulation experiment. And we can also see this through data being sold to third parties that can use it for whatever purpose they want. And we can see this with highly personalized ads, as well as surveillance of companies and selling data to the governments and police forces. This has resulted in today what we have, as Zuboff has called it, a behavioral surplus, which is the commodification of human behavior via excess data. And so as an example, in terms of the relevance of privacy, we can see that the biggest fine ever levied by the FTC was $5 billion against Facebook over privacy violations.
The negative and sometimes destructive effects of surveillance capitalism has manifested itself on a global scale, and different countries have developed methods of accountability to rein in the power of these forces. After it was revealed through documents leaked by former NSA analyst Edward Snowden that the United States had spied on the president of Brazil and collected information from servers like Google, the Brazilian Congress developed an Internet Bill of Rights designed to protect the rights of Brazilian internet users against government spying and overreach, and implemented limits on what corporations could have access to. According to Anthony Bodel, the legislation dubbed Brazil's Internet Constitution has been hailed by experts such as the British physicist and World Wide Web inventor Tim Berners-Lee for balancing the rights and duties of users, governments, and corporations, while also ensuring the internet continues to be an open and decentralized network, proving that one can have an open internet along with government regulation. Included in the bill are net neutrality provision, protection of freedom of expression and information, and limits on the ability of corporations to gather and use the metadata of internet users in Brazil, among other things. The implications behind this chain of events is critical in analyzing the future of a global order influenced by the pressures of surveillance capitalist corporations. Accusations and proof of spying can have a detrimental impact on the cooperation of governments and distress in the companies that have now become essential to the livelihoods of billions across the globe. However, there are issues with the interpretation and implementation of Brazil's internet bill. The judiciary is left to interpret the framework on a case-by-case basis due to the civil law tradition that does not bind future cases to previous decisions. Legislations like the Brazilian Internet Bill of Rights serve as an example for why this current legislation is not enforceable in the context of the United States and will not solve the issues of a lack of regulation against megacorporations.
The consequences of surveillance capitalism have also come to light in the EU. For instance, the Cambridge Analytica scandal in 2018, where a small British political consulting firm compromised the personal data of up to 87 million Facebook users. A few months after this, the EU implemented the General Data Protection Regulation, or the GDPR, which is arguably the most comprehensive data protection framework in the world. The GDPR sets a standardized set of rules for all EU member nations, such as requiring companies to keep records of how they use their consumers' personal data and giving consumers the right to request the specific information on how their data is being used. However, the GDPR isn't perfect. It aims to establish a reasonable level of protection for consumer data, but reasonable is left up to the regulator's interpretation. Nevertheless, we looked at the standardized nature of the GDPR as something that the US could potentially adopt.
Now shifting gears and looking at the US, it is clear that antitrust law is currently insufficient to address the rise of big tech, but it is necessary to contain the growing monopoly power raised by these companies. Many look to the 1998 Microsoft case, in which critics say that the company was left with pretty much a slap on the wrist, and the focus remains on keeping prices low for consumers without much regard to privacy issues or competition law. However, the landscape has changed, and while big tech has transformed sort of the economy in the United States, performative action has been the go-to for many in lieu of enforceable regulation. So Congress hearings with bipartisan critiques in which Democrats focus more on privacy issues and Republicans focus more on content moderation, little has been done.
So I'm going to now talk about one policy solution, which are digital service taxes. So as our goal is to reduce corporate demand for data as a means to safeguard privacy, digital service taxes are a perfect way to achieve this. A digital service tax is an excise tax of 2 to 7% on activities related to the digital service economy. For example, data transfer services and online advertising. Spain and the United Kingdom respectively have implemented a digital service tax. They have noted two things, although they haven't really fully seen the effect because it's been a limited time since they implemented it. But one was higher prices for data assets which has reduced demand. And then second is disincentivized broad collection by these corporations. However, there are some specificities that need to be explored. So the first is revenue and user threshold requirements. For example, in the UK, the company has to earn more than 25 million pounds a year for the excise tax, for the tax to be applicable. Second, tax nexus rules need to be based on user location rather than the company's physical presence in order for the taxes to actually go into effect and for the companies to actually be taxed. And then third, a discussion of whether of the taxes, the profits from the revenues from the tax will be redistributed to the users.
Another policy recommendation we have is to adapt frameworks of competition law for the digital economy. One way in which we can do this is to strengthen consumer protection regulations, to give consumers more agency and knowledge on how their data is collected and used. For instance, online companies should be required to recognize and acknowledge that their services aren't actually free, but are being paid with by consumer data, with or without their consent. The FTC currently has guidelines for how products being marketed as free shouldn't actually incur costs onto the customer, but they haven't been adequately enforced in the context of online companies. Therefore, online companies would also be required to notify their consumers of their personal data costs. We also propose that there should be a national standard for how terms and conditions are laid out. If you look at that blue box on the right, we have an example drawn up by the OECD. As we can see here, consumers should be able to decide from a short list of easy to read options and actually opt out if they wish.
So it's clear that there already exists a relationship between the public and private sector. However, in the US, we recommend that there is more transparency and communication across both lines, and then also in transferring information to the general public. There's huge economical and public interest opportunities in exploiting public data to drive more competition. So the public sector is already a very data intensive sector, as they have a larger capacity to gather data on a widespread scale for safety reasons or otherwise. And it can contribute to making public services more efficient by, for example, shortening lag times in tracking the spread of disease. So Google has been used to track the spread of influenza in real time, just based on people's search histories. It can also help in crime prevention and in making public transport more efficient. So looking at some open data initiatives, we recommend that the US make public data accessible. So using private sector mechanisms to leverage its existing capabilities, this will ensure that sensitive data stays secured and anonymized, especially in the case of people's health and different social services. But there is a small marginal cost for reusing data, so we recommend allowing the public sector to exploit it as well. So private data can also be leveraged for public use. And an example would be, as I mentioned before, tracking influenza epidemics using Google. Some companies, however, have been ambivalent, such as Apple resisting the FBI to unlock phones for security reasons, and AT&T's cooperation with the Bush administration for anti-terrorism receiving a lot of backlash. However, we recommend that the public and private sector just communicate more between each side and to ensure the safety of user privacy. So when incentives fail, we recommend that the US threaten to raise taxes for these companies. So incentives to be considered with caution, however, are confidential treatment of data and also pecuniary compensations.
Great. And when we speak of private sector responses and private and public partnerships in protecting data rights, something else that's important to note is that a consolidated number of major players and big tech companies, some like Sarah has already mentioned, have a lot of influence, particularly in enacting policy that creates a ripple effect and makes the entire ecosystem safer. One example is, for instance, Google phasing out third-party tracking cookies from its own browser, which is Google Chrome, which eventually led thousands and thousands of apps for being safer for users around the world. So we recommend that the government uses these essentially ripple effect opportunities to compel big tech companies to enact these policies. Obviously, these companies usually respond to the interests of their shareholders, but they could still be compelled for more pressure from regulators of the government, as we've already mentioned. Something else that's also important to note is that the government itself also depends on big tech for technological infrastructure, and that shows to be a very interesting arena for cooperation and opportunity between both sides. because from conversations with experts and other research that we've done, we've consistently heard that one of the largest conflicts for the advancement of policy in this specific issue is the gap that exists in knowledge and just general information between what we call the innovators and what we call the regulators.
The rise and widespread development of digital services has resulted in mass digital changes of a daily and significant impact on life for many, and access and institutions in governments such as the European Union are developing legislation to keep up with these changes. The Digital Services Act proposed by the European Commission is a set of comprehensive rules that regulate the responsibilities of digital services that serve the role of intermediaries between consumers and services. According to the Commission, the proposal for the Digital Services Act sets out clear due diligence obligations for online platforms and other online intermediaries. For example, under the new rules, any user will be able to flag illegal content and will also have a clear means of contesting platforms' content moderation, both the platform and through out-of-court mechanisms in their country. The Digital Services Act and the impact that it will have on citizens and companies in the EU align with the recommendations from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission that seek to better establish greater cybersecurity and change the dynamic between the private sector and the government. Utilizing both the impact of the Digital Services Act and recommendations from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, a possible policy and solution that can work within the United States are first, defining digital services in a similar manner to that of the European Commission to create as broad of scope as needed. According to the Act, digital services would include online platforms such as social media networks and markets. Based on the nature of regulation, the United States could seek to expand the scope of this term or utilize the same definition. Furthermore, the Act also places heavier obligations on large platforms and requires more transparency in an effort to understand how online risks develop. The proposal also includes measures for cooperation with specialist trusted flaggers and competent authorities and offers greater transparency requirements for online platforms about decisions on content removal and moderation. Lastly, based on the recommendations from the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, it may be useful for Congress to establish a national cyber director that would serve as a chief advisor to the president for emerging technologies and can therefore more easily engage with the rapid changes that occur in the development of digital services. Increased regulation and protection of consumer rights are needed as digital services continue to grow at an unprecedented rate and have an impact on the daily lives of citizens across the world. It is imperative for governments to begin to create new laws and regulations that keep up to date with new innovations in technology and communications. And the United States can learn a significant amount from the European Union, which has already started to develop more comprehensive regulations.
In conclusion, we can see that with the volume of data increasing and the trend towards personalization, there's been an increase in demand for data, resulting in privacy violations that have gone largely unabated. Therefore, it is imperative that the US take regulatory action following the recommendations outlined in this presentation.